Hi, Don.
Hey, how's it going?
Good.
Hey, Don.
Hi, Jerry.
You're
Yeah,
looking
should have.
good.
Oh, thank you. I should have asked who was going to be here. Although I guess this is a pleasant surprise. Hey, good
Do you
book.
need, are you going to share anything, Don? Share your screen or anything?
Probably not. Actually, at one point I might.
Okay.
So if you just want to give me the
Okay,
palette.
I'll make you a co-host so you can do that when you want.
Great. I apologize in advance. My wife is about to put our kids to sleep, and that can sometimes turn into a noisy endeavor. So if you hear screaming, that's they're not victims, they're violent usurpers.
I just had to break up a cat fight in the bathroom.
Not quite. They were about to.
Well,
He
Yeah,
broke
I
it.
might.
I'm sorry, Jerry.
I said Brian broke it up before they had the fight. That's
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, we just got a new kitten and we have a 12-year-old cat. And so he is filled with energy and just wants to play, and she just wants to be left alone. So in addition to the kids, you might hear some some annoyance from an elderly cat.
How old's the older cat?
What's that?
How old is the older cat?
She's about 12.
Oh yeah, so definitely
set in
like
her
leave me
ways.
alone, kitten.
Yeah.
No, this is interesting.
I'm texting Warren the Zoom link. He just texted me.
Okay. Did you get the email? Okay, we'll get started in just a few minutes. Well, before we get started, I know some of you are probably wondering if this is the March meeting, since we didn't have a meeting last month. And I don't know how many times I have to tell you, but the March meetings are held in March and April meetings are held in April. And since this is April, it's the April meeting. That's been our tradition since we founded the club, and we're going to stick to it. So this is the April meeting. So let's get started.
Oh, Chris, make
the
that
May
motion
meeting will
again.
be-
I think that was very fitting.
Okay, next month's meeting will be on May 17th or May 15th.
That's a
And
May meeting.
as is our tradition, that will be the May meeting. So just so there's no confusion. Jean Maroney will be our guest. And the title of her talk is Own Your Motivation, 3 Keys to Getting Started Instead of Procrastinating. Tonight, our guest is Don Watkins, and his talk is on how to become a more persuasive advocate of objectivism. Don is the author of 4 books, and he hosts a podcast appropriately called The Don Watkins Show. He's a persuasion and communications coach, and he helps his clients create more impactful books, articles, and speeches. He also works with Alex Epstein at the Center for Industrial Progress, where he's the director of education. And yeah, there's a link, or you can see his web address, below his name. So you can go to his website if you want more information. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Don.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. So I'll start with a question and feel free to leave it in the chat or just chime in. I think the group's small enough that it won't be too crazy. And the question is, why do objectivists fail at persuasion? And the implication is not that we always fail at persuasion, but to the extent that we do, what do you think are one or two important factors?
I can speak personally. When I first discovered objectivism, I wanted to kind of jam it down everybody's throat. I was very enthusiastic, and that came across in the way I communicated.
Totally. Yes, that is definitely, I share that. Chris says large knowledge culture gap. Yeah, so it's that there's a lot, like this is not, a kind of like small single idea that you're trying to convey. It's a very different set of ideas. Janine says radical ideas. Yeah, so it's not just a little different, but a lot different, very unfamiliar, challenges a lot of fundamentals. Anybody else want to chime in?
I think we also use terminology that's not understood. It's unique to objectivism.
Yeah, you broke up a little bit, but I think the main point came through, which is that Chris puts it as jargon. There's a lot of terminology. Some of it is just philosophic terminology, which is not familiar to people. And then there's a lot of terms of art that objectivists have, and that can make communication difficult. Jay Reynolds mentioning Ayn Rand and instantly prompting ad hominem against her resistance. Yeah, that's something maybe we'll talk about in the question period, because there is this issue of people, like her name carries a lot of baggage, has a lot of positives too. A lot of people are, fascinated by her, interested in her. But there's a lot of kind of built-in negative views, and there's some, I have some thoughts on how to deal with that. So I think all of those are right. And a lot of them, I think, get at the way that I would put it, which is we're often seen as salesmen for a dogma, not innovative problem solvers. And so, I can talk in the Q&A, and you can look at my stuff for like a bunch of strategies and tactics and principles of persuasion. But I think the main thing that I want to connect everything to and leave you with is that the mind is really having the right mindset, which is that the goal should never be to sell objectivism, but to help your audience achieve a better future. That objectivism, the way I think about it, is not the product, it's your tool for solving problems that the audience can't solve or can't solve as well as they would like. And it's an incredibly powerful tool, but that when you treat it as the product, when you treat it as, I want to get you to buy into this ideology, it feels like people are being sold a dogma, and that's a huge turnoff. And it also just makes it hard to do everything else right. And we'll talk about some of the everything else as we go along. I want to give it was a very nice introduction. I'll give a little bit of background, but from a certain perspective, which is that persuasive communication is something that I had to learn. I definitely it did not come natural to me. So I was always a good writer in the sense of I could string together clear sentences. But when I got hired by the Ayn Rand Institute in 2006, I really knew nothing about persuasive communication. And it really took me a few years of constant editorial feedback before I was even able to start to write publishable stuff. But then over time, through a lot of work, I was able to, I think, have a lot of things click in place. And by 2017, I'd written the 4 books that were mentioned, done countless talks, interviews, and debates. But I still felt like I could not, I was not able to perform at the level that I wanted to get the results that I wanted to get. And so I decided to go and work with my longtime friend and mentor, who had also worked with me at ARI way back when, Alex Epstein, who, as you guys probably know, is the author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, which is incredibly successful, and particularly it's very successful at taking people who expect to disagree with him about energy issues and moving them in a pro-fossil fuel direction. And so for 3 years, I helped Alex create messaging for the public, industry, and political leaders, and was also heavily involved in sales and marketing. And so I learned a ton directly from Alex, but maybe more importantly, it was a unique experience of like getting real clear feedback on what principles actually led to results. Because the fact is that nobody's going to pay you 5 and 6 figures, at least not for long, for messaging that's not getting them the results they want to get. So there was this incredible market feedback and an incredible mentor to help me like conceptualize the different principles. And so since then, what I do is I help people who share my ideas, or at least some of my ideas, become more effective themselves at winning over supporters and having a bigger impact. And so that includes major policy think tanks that have worked with me to create messaging on things like healthcare, all the way to a client who now just landed a book deal with a major publisher. And so in this, I guess, an hour or so that we have, I'm not going to be able to give you all of that. You can go to donswriting.com where I have a lot of material. And then on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Don Watkins Live, you'll find my free Persuasion Mastery video course. And you can always feel free to email me at don@donswriting.com. But what I want to do for the bulk of my time here is something that I've actually never talked about publicly. So you guys are going to get something new. But I think I was thinking a lot about what would be most useful to you guys. And one of the things I've noticed is that I recently did an interview on writing with Keith Lockitch from the Ayn Rand Institute. And one of the things we were talking about afterwards is how hard it is without having concrete examples to convey what clear persuasive writing looks like, and how, we were both we were happy with the content, but wished that we were able to show examples the way that, like, in a classroom, Keith points out he has a decade of, student examples for every particular point he wanted to make. So what I thought I would do is I'm going to read 2 pieces that tackle the same issue from an objectivist perspective, the need for a proper moral defense of capitalism. And it was reading these 2 pieces together side by side that was one of the biggest breakthroughs for me in understanding how to present objectivism persuasively. And it'll take me about probably 10 minutes to read both pieces. And don't worry about kind of following all the details or making sure you catch everything or retain everything. What I want you to do is put the focus on putting yourself in the shoes of someone who's sympathetic to free markets, but not an objectivist, and just think about how they would react to each of these. And then I'm going to go and kind of extract some lessons. And let's see. Okay, here it is. So the first one is called Capitalism and the Moral High Ground, and this was by Craig Biddle and TOS, I believe in 2010, somewhere around there. Okay, and I'm not going to read the whole things, in part because copyright reasons, but in part, we only need to get, I think, a bit to get what the major points are. Okay. Economists from Adam Smith to Ludwig von Mises to Henry Hazlitt to Thomas Sowell have elucidated the general mechanics of a free market and demonstrated the unassailable practicality of capitalism. They have shown how freer markets provide better and cheaper healthcare, cleaner air and water, safer automobiles and airplanes, ample food and energy, better and cheaper schools, and so on. But their arguments have not convinced the world to embrace capitalism. On the contrary, people today are condemning the system of private property as loudly as ever. According to Congressman Jim Moran, Americans must abandon the simplistic notion that people who have wealth are entitled to keep it. Congresswoman Maxine Waters, addressing oil company CEOs, openly threatens to socialize their industry. Guess what this liberal would be all about? This liberal would be about socializing all of your companies. Philosopher Noam Chomsky insists that putting people in charge of their own assets breaks down the solidarity that comes from doing something together and diminishes the sense that people have responsibility for each other. Unquote. All such assaults on free markets and property rights proceed from the recognition of the fact that these key elements of capitalism enable selfishness. As Karl Marx explained, the right of a man to property is the right to enjoy his possessions and dispose of the same arbitrarily, without regard for other men, independently from society, the right to selfishness. And as President-elect Barack Obama intimates, who would dare to make a virtue out of selfishness? How do so-called advocates of capitalism respond to accusations of its inherent selfishness? Some, such as George Gilder, simply deny it. Selfishness is not the essence of capitalism, writes Gilder. Altruism is the essence of capitalism. Capitalism begins with giving. The deepest truths of capitalism are faith, hope, and love. This, of course, is ridiculous. Capitalism begins not with giving, but with producing, and then moves on to keeping, using, and trading the product of one's effort for other values in the marketplace. Nor is capitalism based on faith or hope. Rather, it is based on reason and long-term planning, which are the means by which businessmen succeed and grow rich. And although love is certainly essential to capitalism, the relevant object of love in this context is money. Capitalism is the system of the selfish pursuit of profit, and to deny this, as Gilder does, is to abuse the meaning of words. Other defenders of capitalism, such as Michael Novak, attempt to reconcile its selfish nature with conventional morality. Quote, while recognizing that no system of political economy can escape the ravages of sinfulness, capitalism has attempted to set in place a system which renders sinful tendencies as productive of good as possible. While basing itself on something less than perfect virtue, reason, self-interest, it has attempted to draw from self-interest its most creative potential. It is a system designed for sinners in the hopes of achieving as much moral good as individuals and communities can generate under conditions of ample liberty. Unquote. So by freeing sinners to pursue their reasoned self-interest, capitalism taps into the creative potential of these depraved souls and thereby achieves moral good. This too is absurd. To concede the immorality of a social system is to concede the argument for it. The attempt to defend capitalism on the grounds that it is morally bad, or at best neutral, but economically good is precisely what has failed the aforementioned economists. The practicality of capitalism is insufficient grounds for its defense against those who assert its immorality. We who wish to advocate capitalism must do so on moral grounds. The moral grounds on which we must advocate capitalism, however, are not those of conventional wisdom. Capitalism enables everyone to act in a consistently self-interested manner. Rather than shying away from this unassailable fact, we must embrace and emphasize it. We must do so not on the pragmatic grounds that doing so will work to defend capitalism, which it will, but on the principled grounds that the selfishness enabling characteristic of capitalism is in fact what makes it the only moral social system on earth. To see why this is so, let us begin by observing how capitalism enables economic selfishness and what this means in practice. So I'll stop there. And the next thing I'm going to read, and then we will get on to discussing this. So this is from Why Conservatives Can't Stop the Growth of the State. This is by Alex and Yaron from Why Businessmen Need Philosophy. And so this was published around the same time in 2010, 2011. When Americans want less government, they typically turn to conservatives, politicians, activists, pundits, and intellectuals who advocate conserving America's tradition of limited government and free enterprise, and to the Republican Party, conservatives' political home. Conservatives rail against big government and demand that individuals and businesses be left freer, keep more of their money, and suffer less from red tape. As conservative icon William F. Buckley declared in his National Review mission statement, quote, "It is the job of centralized government in peacetime to protect its citizens' lives, liberty, and property. All other activities of government tend to diminish freedom and hamper progress. The growth of government, the dominant social feature of this century, must be fought relentlessly," unquote. If we look to history, however, there is a dismaying disconnect between conservative rhetoric and results. For many decades, conservatives have argued and campaigned for a more limited government and talked about the evils of government intervention. They have often been supported by the American people, including businessmen desperate to get the government off their backs. And yet the government only grows. Since 1965, inflation-adjusted government spending has sextupled from $0.6 trillion to over $3.5 trillion annually. And government controls have grown exponentially. Conservatives have not only failed to stop this, indeed, they have never cut spending, even when they were intellectually and politically dominant. They have also been active participants in the growth of big government. And then we get examples from Nixon all the way up to today. I'll skip those and go to the upshot. No matter who is elected to the House or Senate, no matter who becomes president, no matter how low Democrats' poll ratings sink, no matter how charismatic the Republican leadership is, or how popular conservative pundits are, or how much the public seems to support limited government, or how much political leaders claim to revere free enterprise, the conservatives do not reduce, but frequently increase the size and scope of government. Then skipping a little. Those who really want to reverse the growth of government must understand why conservatives always fail. To this end, it is instructive to note a highly predictable pattern by which limited government loses and expanded government wins out in the public debate and therefore in politics. Conservatives are good at appealing to Americans in abstract, vague, and emotionally loaded terms that small government is better than big government. But when it comes to real concrete issues in the cultural political debate, such as whether to let gasoline prices rise, Nixon, whether to rein in Social Security, Reagan, or whether to cut social spending, Republican Revolution, conservatives don't reduce the long-term growth of government intrusion. On the contrary, whatever problems Americans have with big government in the abstract, time and again, liberals succeed in convincing the country that more government is needed. This happens because of a conflict in the attitudes most Americans hold. While they have a definite affinity for capitalism, they also have a fundamental discomfort with its central feature, the selfish pursuit of profit by businessmen. Liberals capitalize this by arguing in case after case that the cause of Americans' unease with the selfishness of capitalism is to blame for America's problems, and that more controls and spending are necessary to curb it. This argument takes two major forms. One, limited government unleashes the self-interest or the selfishness or greed of businessmen, causing massive economic problems. And two, a limited government fails to make businessmen and other rich individuals serve the need of others. These arguments, the argument from greed and the argument from need, continue to fuel the growth of government decade after decade because conservatives can't answer them. But where conservative arguments fail, other arguments can succeed and open the path to a better, freer future. And then I'm just going to read a few paragraphs to the next section where they're going into the argument from greed. Pick an economic problem, any economic problem, the financial crisis, rising healthcare costs are the leading story in today's newspaper. Now answer the following questions. 1, what is the perceived cause of the problem? 2, what is the perceived solution? In almost every case, the answers will boil down to 1, greedy businessmen, and 2, more government controls to restrain them. For example, why do we have a financial crisis? The headlines of popular publications tell the prevailing story. Greed, stupidity, delusion, and some more greed. Next headline, human greed to blame for the financial crisis. Next headline, Pope, greed and selfishness caused crisis. Next headline, the Dalai Lama blames greed for financial crisis. The solution in each article was more government restraint of greed. The same pattern holds everywhere. And then we get examples of help from healthcare, jobs, gasoline prices, electricity prices, food prices, and it goes on from there. So let's see. Any reactions or thoughts that you guys want to share? And thank you for indulging me. I know it's hard to listen to the written word read aloud, and I know I'm not the most eloquent of aloud readers. But any thoughts, questions, insights, reactions that you guys want to share? Janine raises the question, Marxism. Chris says the second seem more accusatory towards conservatives.
I thought Biddle's piece got to selfishness too quickly. That's a word that's going to really raise the ire of a lot of people. And it struck me as putting the reader off very quickly in the piece. He hadn't prepared the reader for that, whereas the second one got to it more gradually and didn't just pound the reader with that.
Yeah, I think that's perceptive. Jerry says the second one started with a narrower topic, Republicans and big government. Warren said the second had more concrete headlines. Yeah. So I'm going to go through the first article, the Craig Biddle's article again, and share sort of the thoughts that I had while reading it. And let me say, I'm going to be critical, but the reason to be critical is not that this is like an especially bad article. It's an especially typical of objectivist writing. And so it's the kind of thing that will often get a lot of praise, but that I think the problems are illustrative. And I've certainly committed every single problem that I'm going to point out. But I think since this was such a big breakthrough for me, hopefully it will be helpful to you. I don't know how to pronounce your name, Marin. So
you got
forgive
it
me.
right the first time.
All right. But you say, I think that the second was more approachable for people who have more limited vocabulary.
Yeah, and
So-
I also think that the approach that Yaron takes is also a little bit more along the storytelling, more so, which is also, I think, more relatable to more people outside of the objectivist community.
All right. So let me go through then and just share how I experienced this. And I think you'll be able to see some of the lessons here. And like, you may disagree with some of this, and that's fine. The goal is not the particulars of analyzing this article. We're trying to extract some wider lessons here. So let's start with economists from Adam Smith to Louis von Mises to Henry Hazlitt to Thomas Sowell have elucidated the general mechanics of a free market and demonstrated the unassailable practicality of capitalism. So my first question is, who is this for? So we're asserting right at the beginning that there's an unassailable practical case for capitalism. So we can say, all right, this is definitely not setting out to convince people on the left. So we might think, all right, conservatives, libertarians, maybe objectivists, we'll see where it goes. But then it's economists from Adam Smith to Ludwig von Mises and Henry Hazlitt. So it's taking for granted that the reader thinks, yeah, these guys have established capitalism. So I think that's starting to suggest that maybe not even conservatives is this for, but let's keep reading and see. But we want to have a sense of who the audience is, because that's going to let us know how the audience is actually going to process it. So if we go back to the Yaron and Alex article, it was very clear. This is aimed at people who are concerned about the growth of government, inclined to turn to conservatives for support, particularly, the book is Why Businessmen Need Philosophy. And you'll remember there were some lines about businessmen are turning to conservatives because they want the government off their back. So it seems that they're both kind of addressing a similar audience. So let's look at that more. They, the economists, have shown how freer markets provide better and cheaper healthcare, cleaner air and water, safer automobiles and airplanes, ample food and energy, better and cheaper schools, and so on. But their arguments have not convinced the world to embrace capitalism. Now there's a real question. This probably isn't talking about conservatives, because if you ask most people, has the world embraced capitalism? What's their view? Yeah, except for a couple holdovers, particularly if we're talking 10 years ago, except for a couple holdovers, the whole world has embraced capitalism. Yeah, they might have regulatory welfare states, but like the Cold War is over. So I think we can start to say maybe this is more libertarians that we're talking to. Then we get, on the contrary, people today are condemning the system of private property as loudly as ever. Well, now that's a really striking claim. People are condemning the system of private property as loudly as ever. That means they're calling for the abolition and establishment of, socialism's ownership of the means of production. And you think, really? Like, if you're paying attention to the day-to-day political debate that's going on in Washington, is the reaction that we have is all these people calling for abolishing private property? Yeah, certainly, like, there's some people want taxes higher and we need more welfare but abolishing the system of private property, that's a big claim. So let's see what the evidence is for it. And then we get the three quotes, if you'll remember. So we have Jim Moran saying Americans must abandon the simplistic notion that people who have wealth are entitled to keep it. Maxine Waters saying to oil CEOs, hey, I want to socialize your companies. And then we get Noam Chomsky saying that putting people in charge of their own assets breaks down the solidarity that comes from doing something together and diminishes the sense that people have responsibility for each other. So, my view is this is way insufficient. If we're trying to say that that the mainstream debate, that there's a lot of voices calling for the abolition of the system of public property. We have one congressperson talking about raising taxes on the rich. We have another person saying one particular industry needs to be socialized. And then we have one kind of radical old philosopher that, is well known, but, he's a philosopher. How important is he? Is he the main person driving, the standard Democrat agenda? Probably not. So there's a real feeling of selective, like cherry picking, right? Like I found these three people, two congressmen, not even senators, who said something that's vaguely against particular property rights. And then I have this one like radical professor who's saying something about like that seems to suggest he's against property rights. Have I established that there's this attack on the system of private property and that that's really relevant to today's political debate? I think there's a real question there. I don't think that the average person, even if they're sympathetic to free markets, will think, yeah, this describes my experience. The challenges I face are answering people out to destroy the private property system. But let's keep going. All such assaults on free markets and property rights proceed from the recognition of the fact that these key elements of capitalism enable selfishness. So I think it was Brian who mentioned we get to selfishness really quick. And I'd say it's not just quick, it's out of the blue. So we've heard nothing to suggest that selfishness is relevant. And we are told that this is the key to these attacks on the private property system. So we're going to think, all right, well, let's get some examples of that, and let's see how are these attacks coming from the belief that capitalism enables selfishness. But we don't get that. What we get is a Karl Marx quote where he's talking about private property is based on the right of selfishness. And then Obama, in some context that we don't know, saying, who would dare to make a virtue out of selfishness? And again, I think that's really insufficient. Like, we need more explanation, and then we need more relevancy, because this is like one Marx quote, and it's not even a famous Marx quote. Like, it's from On the Jewish Question, which the only people who read that are objectivists, because it's so great, because he explicitly ties his ideas to a view of selfishness. But if we're thinking some like thing that Marx wrote that I've never heard of, that's the evidence that all the attacks on capitalism come from selfishness. Again, it just feels like we're getting further and further away from a context that we, the audience, can relate to. And so we're starting to wonder, why are we going in this direction? And so the expectation of the audience is that that's going to get elaborated and explained, the way in which it's that the attacks on capitalism are about it unleashing selfishness. But that's not where we go. Where we go is immediately to how do so-called advocates of capitalism respond to accusations of its inherent selfishness? All right, well, that's not really a question either audience have on my mind, but okay, we'll follow along. And so we might think, all right, well, let's look at the greatest, champions of capitalism. What do they say on this issue? After all, if the attack on capitalism is always selfishness, they must have some things to say on it. And so, we mentioned Adam Smith or Thomas Sowell. I'm familiar with those guys. What do they have to say? Well, we don't get what they say. We get George Gilder, who, okay, maybe I vaguely heard of him at some point, and then Michael Novak. Like, maybe if I was around in like the late 80s and early 90s, these guys' names would strike a bell. But okay, well, fine. They'll be the representatives. I, the audience member, though, still think it's a little weird. Like, why are we turning to these guys? So some, such as George Gilder, simply deny that capitalism is inherently selfish. Selfishness is not the essence of capitalism, writes Gilder. Altruism, quote, altruism is the essence of capitalism. Capitalism begins with giving. The deepest truths of capitalism are faith, hope, and love, unquote. So I'm not going to keep saying the audience. You can just imagine, like, my comments are coming from the non-objectivist audience reading this, right? So my question would be, all right, that quote, I don't even know what that guy's saying. Like, what does it mean that altruism and faith and hope are like the essence of capitalism? I'm getting this conclusion, but I'm not getting it explained to me, and I'm not getting Gilder's argument. And I need that to be able to process it, but we're not going to get that. We're just going to get a refutation of this conclusion that we don't understand. And this, of course, is ridiculous. Capitalism begins not with giving, but with producing, and then moves on to keeping, using, and trading. Basically, he gets to capitalism as the system of the selfish pursuit of profit, and to not deny this, as Gilder does, is to abuse the meaning of words. So that just, my reaction is, well, I don't know Gilder, and if it's that obviously crazy, I'm starting to worry maybe there's a straw man going on here, but I don't care anyway because I don't know who Gilder is, so I'll just keep going. Other, quote, defenders of capitalism. So defenders is in scare quotes. And now I'm confused, right? Because you're supposed to be telling me what the defenders of capitalism say about this issue of selfishness, but now it's the quote defenders. Well, why don't you pick some non-quote defenders so that I know what they say? But other, quote, defenders of capitalism, such as Michael Novak, attempt to reconcile its selfish nature with conventional morality. Okay, I don't know what conventional morality is, but let's see what he says. And I won't even read this quote because it's basically the kind of Adam Smith view of, well, actually I will read it because there's a point I want to bring out of it. Quote, while recognizing that no system of political economy can escape the ravages of human sinfulness, capitalism has attempted to set in place a system which renders sinful tendencies as productive of good as possible, while basing itself on something less than perfect virtue, reasoned self-interest. It has attempted to draw from self-interest its most creative potential. It is a system designed for sinners in the hope of achieving as much moral good as individuals and communities can generate under conditions of ample liberty. Okay, so again, that sounds like the standard Adam Smith view, but if you want to use Novak, that's fine. And now that seems like a really good argument. Like, all right, if capitalism does have selfishness, like, it's a great system because it transforms that into something that's good for other people. That seems really compelling to me. So let's see what's wrong with it. So then we get from Craig. So by freeing sinners to pursue their reason, self-interest, capitalism taps into the creative potential of these depraved souls and thereby achieves moral good. This too is absurd. Oh, well, I thought it was pretty persuasive, but now I'm being told it's absurd. So I feel a little insulted because I don't see what's wrong with it. But let's find out what's wrong with it. To concede the immorality of a social system is to concede the argument for it. The attempt to defend capitalism on the grounds that it is morally bad or at best neutral, but economically good, is precisely what has failed the aforementioned economists. Wait a minute. They didn't say that capitalism was evil or immoral. That's exactly what it didn't say. What they said is it takes human nature, which is flawed and it has problems, and it gives us the best possible social system that we could get out of that. Something that takes even the parts of our nature that are not morally noble and leads to a noble outcome. There is nothing in that quote, nothing in the Adam Smith view that concedes that the system is immoral. So this is a complete straw man. There's no answer to that argument here. There's just mocking it and then like caricaturing it. So now I'm completely alienated. And I mean, I'll only keep reading because let's say my teacher assigned it. The practicality of capitalism is insufficient grounds for its defense against those who assert its immorality. We who wish to advocate capitalism must do so on moral grounds. So now remember, I've really had no evidence that the practical arguments are insufficient. Like maybe people haven't heard them well enough. They're just being drowned out by all of these things. And I've seen no reason to think that the actual debate is shaped by morality. Like all we have is like people trying to get people health care, and then the question of like what should the tax rates be and what are we going to do about climate change. That's what I'm concerned with. Those are the questions that are driving me. And this person is talking about like the private property system and selfishness, and I just like, where does that come up in my actual day-to-day experience? And like why in the world are we talking about this? The moral grounds on which we must advocate capitalism, however, are not those of conventional wisdom. Capitalism enables everyone to act in a consistently self-interested manner. A consistently self-interested manner? That's horrible. Like I get, sometimes like people go out and make money. That's pretty good. But if you're consistently self-interest, that includes things like lying, cheating, stealing. So if that's what capitalism allows, that's horrific. Like, I'm starting to really worry. Like I thought this was supposed to be a defense of capitalism, and instead it sounds like a damnation. Rather than shying away from this unassailable fact, we must embrace and emphasize it. We must do so not on the pragmatic grounds that doing so will defend capitalism, which it will, but on the principled grounds that the selfishness enabling characteristic of capitalism is, in fact, what makes it the only more social system on earth. So that's really confusing. If I read it 5 or 6 times, I start to get, I think what he's saying is that like, it's not that we have to suck it up and defend selfishness, even though we don't want to in order to defend capitalism. He's saying that actually selfishness is good and that will defend capitalism. It's something like that. To see why this is so, let us begin by observing how capitalism enables economic selfishness and what this means in practice. And then I'm going to read one more thing that I didn't read initially. Under genuine capitalism, not the mongrel system operative in America today, but pure, unregulated, laissez-faire capitalism, the government prohibits citizens from using physical force against each other, and the Constitution prohibits the government from using force against citizens, except in retaliation against those who initiate its use. Well, wait a minute. What? Like, I want government to get off my back a little bit and like cut my taxes, maybe spend some less. We shouldn't be regulating everything, but laissez-faire capitalism. So now what I'm being told is that in order to defend capitalism that nobody wants, I have to champion selfishness, which everybody knows is evil. Like this just is so like the gap between where I am and where this guy is so big. Like I'm just shutting off. Like there's no way that this feels relevant to me or persuasive to me. So the kind of summary takeaway and what I was trying to emphasize through all of this is that I think what's the issue is that one of these has a certain framework, that this piece has a certain framework, is that I believe that selfishness is good. I believe that laissez-faire capitalism is good. And I believe that if you're going to be logically consistent, you can't defend laissez-faire apart from defending selfishness. That's my framework. That's my way of looking at the world. And now I'm going to just throw that at my audience without really thinking about where they are and then what's required to get them to see this point. And I think what was very striking about the why conservatives can't stop the growth of the state is it was very much connected to exactly where I am. So, let's say I'm conservative leaning or, a business person. It's, yeah, I keep seeing my taxes go up, government spending going up, the regulation going up. I keep voting for these guys in office and things never turn around. They never get better. And then and then it's an explanation for that, oh, well, greedy people create all kinds of messes. Yeah, I hear that all the time. And in fact, you guys gave me like a bunch of examples that I literally read in the newspaper every day. And then it's that greedy people aren't going to take care of the needs of others. My goodness, I hear that all the time. And then I can see how those arguments, yeah, they show up again and again and again in my life. Well, man, I really want to hear what the answer to those arguments is, because that's going to be crucial to me stopping this trend that I really want to stop. So there's lots of differences between the two approaches, but I think the fundamental is one is deeply concerned with where's my audience? What are they out to achieve, and how can I help them achieve that and give them the clarity to understand why they haven't achieved it, and the other is not. And that's why I say the basic orientation is going to be crucial for every kind of element of persuasive communication. So there's a lot more we could say at this point, but I think moving now to kind of discussion and questions, we'll be able to bring out some further points that I have in mind. And feel free to say that was not helpful or it was confusing or whatever. Go ahead.
How do you recommend identifying the audience's context? I mean, I can understand sometimes it's pretty obvious. If you're going to go talk to a tea party, you have a pretty good idea of what their context is. But if you're writing in other circumstances, how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, I would say in most cases, it's actually, well, I'll make a distinction. If you're professional intellectual, then like you should know it, because part of what your job is like study the, context of knowledge. But I think for most of us, we'll pick it up as we go through our lives, right? Like if you're thinking about, you're usually addressing the mainstream, right? Some form of the mainstream people on the left and mainstream people on the right, if we're talking politics, or more for more philosophic things, it's, there's kind of mainstream religious views, mainstream, more secular kinds of views. So that stuff that it's hard not to be familiar with. But usually what it is it's enough to sit down and just as part of your thought process before you start communicating, like before you start writing something, you just sit down and like write out, okay, where are these people at? What are their ideas? What are their values? What are the ideas that I agree with? What are the ideas that I disagree with and have to address? What are the ideas that are sort of right, but I need to help sharpen in their minds? Values, what can I appeal to? What do I have to change? And again, what do I have to clarify or sharpen? Something where they're kind of on the right track, but they haven't really conceptualized it right. Now, in more specialized cases, or if you're just finding that you have a lot of trouble with that, then, I mean, the easiest thing to do is just spend an hour on Google and see, okay, well, like I'm interested in commenting on the healthcare debate. What's out there being argued and like, by the major commentators, and you'll get exactly what the context is pretty quickly. So what becomes really the challenge is usually not in the reader's context. Usually the challenge is if you're interacting with an actual like professional intellectual who has an unconventional context. And even if they're kind of conventional in their views, right? Like, I mean, if you think about, like Matt Iglesias on the left or Thomas Sowell on the right, like they're roughly in kind of the mainstream you know, a little bit more left, a little bit more right, if you want to use that terminology. But they have a very particular way of thinking about the world. And so you'd want to like really delve into that. And if you're not familiar with it, it can be hard to address. But for most people who are not deeply philosophic, I think it's relatively easy to have a sense of it. Jay Reynolds says, is your audience rational or guided by emotions? Chris once noted that if someone did not reach his conclusions via reason, then you cannot reason with him to refute his conclusions. I think you have to assume that the audience is being rational. Like, it's true that you can't, if somebody's like completely not invested in reason, you can't reason with them. But I think that in most cases, most people are mixed. And so they'll often default to, you can think of it, it's not exactly reason versus emotion exactly, but they'll default to kind of a tribal way of looking things. So it's, are you on the good guy's side? Or are you in the bad guy's side? And they're kind of looking at through that way. So it's like, are you checking the right boxes, or are you not checking the right boxes? And so it's not exactly being rational, but it's not exactly, I mean, it is going by emotion, but you have to get the way that that's experienced. It's sort of like they're going by affiliation. And they're the only, what I have found, and what I found in my work with CIP and what I found working with others, is that even many of the people who that's their kind of default, if you give them a really clarifying framework and way to think about an issue, they will get better. They're open to it. It's that what most people do is, this is one of the things that makes persuasion very tricky, is it's very hard to find role models, because most people who seem to be engaged in persuasion are not engaged in persuasion. So if you think about somebody like Ben Shapiro, or if you think about somebody like Ezra Klein, I don't think those kinds of people are engaged in persuasion. I think they have their side that they are trying to, we can put it more positively, they're trying to arm their side. So they're saying like, here, let me show you all the flaws in the other side's arguments. To put it more negatively, I think they're playing to the crowd in order to raise their status within the crowd, within their tribe. And so it's very hard to find people who are even trying to be persuasive. But when people are actually doing that and actually trying to provide clarity to somebody who expects to disagree, even people who tend to just respond in a tribal way can often be surprising in going, you know, I've never heard that before. That's not just like, you know, throwing a, it's not just like hurling some talking points at me. It actually feels empowering because I can see the world now in kind of a different way. And so, though I do think that you can only write insofar as people are being rational, I think even people who are mixed, you can bring out the best in them by being very clarifying in the way that you communicate. Glenn says, how do you deal with arguments that clearly show they have a wrong view of what capitalism is? How do you deal with arguments that... Well, so part of it, so I mean, one thing is, you know, you can define it and give examples of what you mean and what you don't mean. But I think what's very striking in the Yaron and Alex piece is that they get into that, but it's not front and center, because the idea is not, all right, we're out here to defend laissez-faire capitalism. They're not conceding that we should have something less than laissez-faire capitalism. What they're doing is giving the principles for why the arguments that drive people to embrace government control are wrong. And then it's kind of, they leave it more to the reader as a question of, well, are there ever cases are there ever grounds other than these, the argument from need and argument for greed, in which we might need government, you know, say to pave the roads or something? And it's like, that's fine. We can set that aside for another day. What we're doing is helping you think about, all right, no, there's when you unleash selfishness, what you're unleashing is the long-term creativity and value creation and voluntary interaction of people. And when you do that, everybody can get better off at the same time without anybody having to sacrifice to anyone else. And then we can see, all right, like, what is the full kind of expression of that and protection of that? Like, that's kind of a later secondary question. But and so my larger point there is, you have to know what you're trying to prove and what you need to prove to get the result that you want in a given scenario. It doesn't mean you need to hide your views, certainly, but it just means, all right, if we're trying to help people see through the argument and need an argument from greed, if we're helping them understand why the attacks on selfishness are really the root of why government keeps growing and government intervention keeps growing, is that going to be the place where we need to defend laissez-faire? No, that's not our purpose here. And again, that's so you have to think about, why am I making this point? Why am I trying to clarify what I mean by laissez-faire? But if you do, have to give like a clarifying explanation of what capitalism is, then I mean, at the end of the day, it's just basically like definition, contrasts, and examples of this is what I mean, this is what I don't mean. There's other things to say on that, but it's very context dependent. Well, while you guys are thinking about anything that you want to address, so one thing that came up earlier that I definitely wanted to talk about was the point, I forget who made it, that there's Ayn Rand's name carries a lot of baggage, a lot of misunderstandings. People basically have often seemed to have made up their minds at the very start. And like, what do you do in that case? And one of the things that, and it's a hard problem to solve, right? Because like, what do you say? Oh no, like Ayn Rand didn't do this, or that quote's taken out of context, and it just feels like they have 20 other sort of objections. The real issue is people don't care about that once somebody credible recommends Ayn Rand or recommends objectivist ideas. So this was a theme that came through with many of my podcast guests, is that what often happens is they heard the same stuff about how bad she was or this and that about her that, we hear thrown at us all the time, and worry, oh my God, maybe people won't check her out or take her seriously. But then what happens is that somebody that they admire, respect, a mentor, says, hey, you should read Ayn Rand. And so they go, oh, okay. And so this is a wider point, which is, Aristotle in terms of talking about rhetoric, right, has logos, ethos, and pathos. And the ethos is really an issue of your credibility. And credibility is, I think, a really underappreciated part of persuasion. I think credibility, there's at least three forms of it. So one is credibility of knowledge. So like, if the issue is healthcare and you're like a doctor or healthcare economist, okay, I'm more likely to listen to you and take you seriously than if it's like, hey, like I'm, Joe the plumber or whatever. Then there is, you could think of it as credibility of morality, which is the audience respects you. So this is like, if you think about John Allison, part of his credibility is he built a really successful business, but part of it is, oh, he's just a really good person. And so if he's going to tell me that like he got a lot out of reading Ayn Rand, that's something that I might take seriously. And then there's something I would call the credibility of empathy, which is just if you really believe that somebody wants the best for you, they're more likely to listen to what you have to say than if you think they're trying to score points on me or they're trying to show that they're superior to me in some way. So there's different routes to credibility, but you have to think, what kind of credibility do I have in this persuasive encounter? And if I don't have any going in, how do I establish it? And one of the ways you can establish it is just through the clarifying nature of your arguments. If you're able to explain the world to people in a way that, even if they're not fully convinced, seems interesting, promising, and clarifying, then they're going to lean forward and listen. So, for example, one of the things that we teach at the Center for Industrial Progress is that one of the most powerful things you can do in one-on-one conversation is, you're not trying to have a 30-minute debate with somebody that's going to convince them to embrace fossil fuels. What you're trying to do is explain your views in a way that establishes you as somebody who's thoughtful enough to give a worthwhile recommendation, and then you give them a recommendation of a persuasive resource. So it's that I want to try to show, hey, I'm thoughtful and have an interesting view that you haven't heard before that seems promising, and then say, hey, if you want to learn more about that view, there's this book that was really helpful to me, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. You should read it. So you can establish credibility by just being able to make a really good case for yourself. But having in your mind of like, all right, where does my credibility stand? Versus if you just ran up to somebody in the street and said, hey, read Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. Like, read Atlas Shrugged. Well, who are you? Why should I care? That's one major thing that I think a lot about when I'm thinking about persuasion. Warren says, it's been said by others, but the quick movement to too abstract a level seems a common feature of bad arguments. What guidance do you have for broadening person's perspective without moving too fast to a level of abstraction that loses them? Well, I don't think that it's exactly an issue of level of abstractness. Setting aside the guy's flaws, in 2016, before he really got famous, I saw Jordan Peterson, he was getting already, hundreds of thousands of views on his videos, and people were starting to have this response that we've all seen play out over the years. And one of the things that I noticed is that, like, he was talking about issues in metaphysics and epistemology, like going super abstract and super deep, and people really liked it. And I remember walking to ARI and saying, we are not being philosophical enough. Like, there's a market, like, people want depth, but the issue is, do you actually leave them baffled by what you're talking about, or do you explain it? You can go super deep. And if you think about Ayn Rand's essays, right? Even when she's doing her Ford Hall forums that are addressed to the general public, she will, or even take her columns, which are an even better example, because that she wasn't even presupposing that they were such huge fans that they'd, come out and see her speak. But through your most grievous fault, she's talking about the death of Marilyn Monroe. And then she gets into kind of the deepest issues about nihilism and envy and hatred of the good. You can go really deep as long as it's objective, as long as the connection between what you're saying and reality is clear, and as long as it's motivated. That is, as long as the people can see, like, oh, you're not just talking about abstractions that are remote from life. You're helping me understand life by going deeper. And people actually find that really, really appealing, particularly thoughtful people. And I actually think we often do ourselves harm by dumbing things down too much and thinking, oh man, I can't get too philosophic, or I'm just going to leave people cold. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes, you want to kind of only go as deep as you absolutely have to go to deal with something. But I'm all for people who want to be ambitious. You just have to be able to do it in that people can see what you're saying and why you're going there. Let me give you an example of what doesn't work, just so that maybe this will help concretize it. So it's, you're writing something on Obamacare, and then it's, in order to decide whether or not this is the right thing, we need to step back and ask, what's the purpose of government? Well, I say that the purpose of government is to protect individual rights so people can pursue their life and live selfishly. Now, selfishness isn't what you've always heard. It's non-sacrifice. It's long-term. Like I'm interested in should we do about healthcare. There's a lot of people, like my healthcare bill is going up like crazy. My cousin can't even get insurance because he has asthma since he was a kid. And like whatever you're talking about, I don't care. I don't see why in the world you're going into that. It sounds like you just have your kind of like ideological framework that you're trying to that you know you see everything through, and you're not looking at the real problems and challenges that people have. Versus that if you can motivate and explain, if you can bring depth and help people understand the dynamics of the debate and things with deeper ideas, it can actually be very effective. And Warren says that's a great example, the Obamacare one. So that's the advice. Make sure abstractions are motivated and the connection to reality is clear. Yeah. And again, I think the best examples are just go read how Ayn Rand does it. And I mean, she's the absolute master of going back and forth between really deep philosophy and really practical stuff. Some of her more theoretical pieces I wouldn't exactly use as a template. Like, you know, what is capitalism? It's brilliant and genius, but there she's starting at an abstract level and then going like 10 times more abstract. And you're dealing with a monumental genius who's writing something for the ages. But look at her more occasional pieces. And I think that gives you the model of how actually to do it. Yeah, so that's what I would say on that.
I have a comment about something you said at the very beginning. You said objectivism shouldn't be our product. We should view ourselves as innovative problem solvers. And there's actually an example from here in Houston that probably everyone's familiar with. 30 years ago, there was a debate raging in this city over zoning. And Warren and I and a few other members of HOS wrote letters to the editor, went to City Hall and testified, spoke to civic groups, wrote op-ed article, all kinds of things. We had an influence on the debate. I don't think we mentioned Ayn Rand, certainly not 5 times over 3 years. We were just addressing the issue and presenting philosophical and moral arguments against zoning, but we weren't peddling objectivism.
Yeah, and I mean one of the things you'll see like in Alex's work is that sometimes she'll just come up organically, and he's already established himself as like an interesting, credible thinker. Now, part of it is let's see, how do I want to frame this? So there's issues of what we all need to do to be persuasive, and then there's issues of what a persuasive intellectual should be doing, and then there's issues of what does a persuasive movement look like. But one of the things that one of the things to be aware of is that if the argument is, hey, this person has all the answers, you've instantly now, if you do it that way, which is kind of the like traditional objectivist mode of like, I want people to be interested in objectivism, so I have to tell them how amazing Ayn Rand is. You're already framing yourself, rightly or wrongly, from other people's perspective as, well, this isn't a thinker, this is like a repeater. And that is that it's one way to put it is you're losing credibility. So it's not that you have to hide any, like that you learn stuff from Ayn Rand or so on, but unless you're like, you work at the Ayn Rand Institute and you're there as the expert on like Ayn Rand, like you as a person, you have a way of looking at the world. And yeah, you learned it from Ayn Rand, but it's not like you're a mouthpiece. Like this is your firsthand view of the world, and you're sharing with people your firsthand view of the world. And it's not an issue of denying credit. You give, credit when it's organic, but like we don't, if you think about most of the times that we most of the things we know, we learned from somewhere. And yet it's not like, hey, did you know that bridge was built, by the, British in like 1585? Here's my footnote. I learned that from like, this historian Alfred so-and-so. Like, people don't do that. You don't need to do that. And that the focus is on, I'm trying to clarify things for people that I have had clarified for me. And then once that they have the sense that you're a person who's thoughtful, interesting, first-handed, once they get that sense, and then you say, yeah, I learned this idea from Ayn Rand that was like, she had this book, Atlas Shrugged, that really helped me understand a lot of these issues. Now it's very different from I'm a mouthpiece for Ayn Rand. It's I'm an interesting, thoughtful, credible person. And then I gave credit to this influence of mine. It's just a completely different dynamic. And that's why, to go back to Jordan Peterson as an example here, he basically is just regurgitating things like Jung and pragmatism. But people don't go around saying, oh, this is just a regurgitator of Jung and pragmatism. It's, oh, that's Jordan Peterson. And then he says, oh, I learned this idea from Jung. I learned this idea from Dostoevsky. I learned this idea from William James. Like, he gives credit all the time. But it's experiences giving credit, not just like a person repeating things that they've read elsewhere. And those are just two really different things. And you want to be in the category of a recommender, not a repeater. Which is a really good formulation I just came up with. So I got to write that down. Yeah. So, but to go to the initial point that you made. So when I said like what we want to be is problem solvers, I actually, one of the things I usually do, because to give people a model of what good persuasion looks like, is you always want to have like something that they're familiar with. And ideally, I like to have one that's nonpartisan, that doesn't like set off tribal alarm bells for people. And I actually think one of the most persuasive presentations I've ever seen is Steve Jobs releasing the first iPod. And you can look it up on YouTube. But basically, you get almost every relevant principle of persuasion there. So first of all, he's speaking directly to a problem that people have, or if they don't have it at the top of their mind, as soon as they hear it, they go, oh yeah, I want a solution to that. And that's like, music is amazing, and our options to listen to it as we go about our life and we're not in front of our stereo, they suck. Like, you either have this CD Walkman that's like only holds 12 songs and it skips all the time, or you have these really expensive, bulky things that like are like not at all very useful or usable. And so, all right, now there's a problem I want it solved. And I think you're Apple, so maybe you can solve it. I'm on the edge of my seat. Well, then he establishes the superiority of his solution. So he doesn't just come out and say, here's the iPod, here's what it does. He literally lines it up by all the competitors and says, look, we need to make an evaluation by looking at the positives and negatives of each of these. And he goes through and shows my solution is way superior. And then in cases where you might not think it's superior, so this, for instance, this iPod is more expensive than some of the alternatives. But if we look not at the sticker price, but at the price per song that it holds, it is the most affordable of them all. And then it's, okay, so you've established a superior solution to a problem that I have. Then he makes it unforgettable. That is, you're going to walk out of there and not go, that was a great presentation. What was he talking about? Which is, for most of my career, that's the reaction I would get to my talks. Like, that was great. And then you'd say, oh, what'd you take away? And you're like, I don't know. I just thought it overall was really great, man. I dug it. And they really mean it, but it means I failed because nothing stuck with them. And yet he makes it unforgettable, because what does he say multiple times? 1,000 songs in your pocket. That tells you everything you need to know. You're never going to forget it. You know, like, why should I buy an iPod rather than the competitors? 1,000 songs in my pocket. Oh my God, how cool is that? That connecting to the problem that people have, establishing a superior solution. So you're contrasting with the alternative attempts to solve this problem that people have, and then making it unforgettable in part by making it super retainable. That's why, like, something like be a recommender, not a repeater, like that's more likely to stick with you than a lot of the points that I've made, because it's super retainable, right? And so that's kind of the trifecta of like core principles of persuasion. And so, I highly recommend go watch his presentation and then think about, like, how can I be more like Steve Jobs as a persuader, not just a producer? Cool. Any other questions or issues that people want to raise? We've been talking about kind of the more like universals of persuasion, but we can definitely talk about, like, what do objectivist intellectuals need to be doing? What do organizations need to be doing? Any particular problems that you've run into on particular issues?
I have a new book out, and boy, is it the persuasion part is a little tricky for the mass audience. But I do not actually want to monopolize HOS meeting for that, so anyone else can jump in. Oh yeah, he's got a better book.
Chris, yours is 1,000 jokes in your pocket.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually the theory behind all of them. So it's not just 1,000; it's whatever many there are. So. But you're right. It would be helpful to get some kind of a memorable condensation of what I've got.
Yeah, and it's funny. It's super hard, and often the people who are most effective at reaching large audiences, whether it's creating products or books or things like this, and I think David Allen from Getting Things Done, if I recall correctly, he talks about kind of his process for creating a book. And I think, if I'm getting this right, he starts with writing the New York Times book review for it. Like, he hasn't even written the book yet, but it's, what is that distilled thing that's going to, like, make people desperate to want to buy this book, want to talk about it? And it's get that and then write the book. And man, I wish I had taken that advice. I think I even tried on one of my books, and I haven't written a nonfiction book since 2016. So so much of what I've learned about persuasion, I've learned in the years since then. But it's a lot harder to take something and then figure out how to sell it than to create something sellable. Like, that is just universally true, that if you should be thinking in terms of like persuasion and sales from the start rather than from the end. And I don't mean you in particular, because sometimes there's just passion projects that we want to understand something, or we have a specialized audience that's kind of pre-motivated to buy it. But if we're in the context of our, aim is to reach a large audience, or our context is that we're like really trying to persuade, the more that can be done up front. Because one of the things that often happens is that I'll get writers who come to me, and it's, okay, I'm going to write this article. How do I make it persuasive? And often the mistake is, if you want to be persuasive, that's not the right article to write. In other words, the persuasion doesn't start once you've got a topic. It starts when you're choosing a topic. So, like, for instance, if I'm going to write on a thing that, what's an example that won't be offensive to my friend? The problem is, a lot of things that come to mind, I don't want to insult the authors because I have a lot of respect for them. But it'll be some kind of like particular interest of theirs. Like, oh, there's this quirky, writer that I follow who just made this point about, Thomas Aquinas that I think is, really interesting. And this kind of subtle issue in about altruism or religion or something. All right, I wrote my essay on that. How do I make this, widely read? It's, well, don't write that article. Or if you do, you have to think of a hook that makes it like super relevant. That's why, like, one good thing to do is if you want to really seriously build your skill set, is read things that are not speaking primarily to tribes, but are speaking to an intellectual mass audience. So, like, for instance, the best example I usually give is The Atlantic. The Atlantic has a lot of pieces that are dealing with ideas. The audience for them sometimes is like, this is kind of, going to really get, the left will love this or the right will love this, but often it's not taking a line that's kind of neatly divisible and along tribal dividing lines. And you can read them and see how they're able to do that and how they're able to take these weird topics. In fact, let's actually do this right now. This will be fun. Let's see. Oh, well, this is funny. So Arthur Brooks, who's a conservative, has an article, How to Buy Happiness. So instantly, like, that, people are going to click on that because the saying is you can't buy happiness, and this is how to buy happiness. It's kind of intriguing, right? Or here's an even better example of what I'm talking about: An Ode to the Left Hand. Like, if I told you, hey, I'm going to write a piece on why it's awesome to be left-handed, like, you would say, Don, I've written pieces on, like, the life and death issues of the day and have 100 people read them. How are you gonna make people want to read about, like, an ode to your left hand? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And yet I bet if we sat down and read that piece, it would be really fascinating and fun and have all kinds of interesting observations. So anything, no matter how weird, can be done interestingly, but you have to really think through, how am I going to make it interesting? Jay Reynolds, when advocating objectivism, I stick to principles and lots of Ayn Rand quotes without attribution to put points across. Then Warren, perhaps the deeper methodology here is to think of the world all the time in terms of essentialized summaries of what you want to accomplish or persuade a person about. The way that I think about it is, obviously this whole thing was framed as persuasion. I talk about what I do in terms of persuasion, but I actually don't think about it as persuasion. So there's the kind of conventional model of persuasion. There's two. One is persuasion is manipulation, which is like that kind of marketing thing about saying, hey, I have my, free download. There's only 20 of them left. It's like, what do you mean there's only 20 of them left? Like, it's false scarcity. This is the internet. I know there's infinite, like, you're putting one over on me. So there's persuasion as manipulation. But then there's persuasion as what you can think of as, I call it logical brute force. And I'm going to start with some starting point that's effectively an axiom that I think nobody can object to. And then I'm going to take you logical point by point, and you won't be able to poke a hole in it. And so you'll just have to surrender and accept my conclusion. And I think the article we read has a little bit of that flavor to it. And what I think is that what you're actually doing in persuasion, what a Steve Jobs does, is neither of those, right? It's establishing superior solutions to problems. But another way to think about it is sharing what persuaded you. So when I'm trying to persuade others, all I'm doing is sharing, this is the process that I went through to reach the conclusion that I currently have. Now, you better have a good process. That's one of the great things about objectivism, is it makes you self-conscious about this is how one should think about an issue. I went through that process that is the one that actually leads to knowledge. And so essentially what I'm doing is just sharing that with somebody else. Now, I'm not literally just doing it biographically because I'm taking into a context where are they, which might not be where I was, right? I might have gone through very different steps. Like I might have heard about this new issue in energy, and my way of getting to the conclusion was to go back to, all right, well, how do you individual rights apply here? Well, that's not going to work. If I'm just talking to the guy in the street and he's saying, what should we do about climate change? I say, well, let's start with thinking about how individual rights apply here. So my point is not that you're always going to do it biographically, but that the whole essence of what you're really doing is you're sharing how you think about the issue, what persuades you the issue, connecting it to where they are and what their ideas and values are. And then letting them go on that journey themselves of thinking through the issue. So there's no attempt to manipulate. There's no attempt to strong arm. And if you think about the kind of logical brute force, why doesn't that work? Well, the reason it doesn't work, and this connects to what we've been going through tonight. If you really want to get at why the summary version of why a piece like the TOS piece doesn't persuade anybody, is that when you take a starting point, even if the reader agrees with it, and then you kind of logically take step by step to this conclusion way over here, what you have left untouched is the whole context of knowledge that that person has. Every item of knowledge, every value they hold. If you haven't reconceptualized all that, which of course you haven't, because you're only just giving this like very quick step-by-step argument, then they have all of that context pushing against them. So it's, all right, like I kind of, his logic seemed to follow A to B to C to D. But on the other hand, I know 10,000 things that say that's BS. So for instance, let me give you an example. I can give like the tightest seeming deductive argument for why we should abolish Social Security. People have a right to what they earn. And I'm speaking to an American audience, let's say, and let's even say they're conservatives. So like they'll buy into that, right? People have a right to what they earn. Social Security takes from you what you earn and gives it to other people. Therefore, we need to abolish Social Security. Now, from one perspective, that's an airtight argument that started from a place that I can expect my reader to agree with. But now, what have I left in their minds? Well, I've left without Social Security, I'm going to starve in the street. I've left, well, wait, what do you mean? Like, what about the people who can't earn? What about the fact that, isn't Social Security an earned benefit because it's based on like what I earn and there's some kind of trust fund or something like that? And, isn't it selfish and cold-hearted to do that sort of thing? And every country on earth has it. So like, how can you even question it? There's all of these kinds of pieces of their context that are left intact and are pushing against my seemingly airtight chain of logic. And so this is why one of the major things we teach, and I didn't go into this here, but it's on my YouTube channel, is framing. So what framing is that underlying every argument, thought process, act of persuasion are certain methods, assumptions, and methods, assumptions, I'm missing one, and goals that shape how people think about things. So they might have a billion different views of Social Security, but underlying that are certain goals, methods, and assumptions. And just to name that. So your goal is essentially your standard of value in a given domain. So like Alex will often talk about, like he makes his goal explicit. I'm for human flourishing, not minimizing impact on the planet. Methods are, how should we think about this issue? And what you want are methodological points that the person listening will regard as common sense, but aren't necessarily practicing. So in energy, it'll often be people are biased. They only look at the positives of wind and solar. They only look at the negatives of fossil fuels. And then people go, oh yeah, we shouldn't be biased. We need to look at the positives and negatives of all the alternatives. And then assumptions are basically views of cause and effect that are underlying a certain view. It's not always causal assumptions, but usually it is. And so, for instance, there in energy, one of the kinds of assumptions is that we are polluter depleters, that human beings have a negative impact in the world. We extract resources from a finite planet and we pollute a planet. We make it worse through our productive actions. Well, if you are able to give people a better framework, then those thousands of facts and stories and misconceptions that they've heard, now suddenly through a very brief few steps, you're able to put them in a position to reconceptualize all of that, toss some of it out, correct some of it. They're not going to do it right there, but you're putting them in the right track. You're empowering them to do it with a framework that they can easily accept. So that's kind of the real heart of objectivist persuasion, is when we get into issues of framing. And Warren has to sign off. Thank you for coming. So I definitely recommend checking out my course. And one of the things that I do there, because you might have heard like Alex or me talk about framing in different places, but particularly in that course, one of the things I do is I sketch out in quite a bit of detail what I call the anti-freedom and pro-freedom framework, and give like a bunch of examples of like, if I'm trying to figure out what is the framing for this issue or that issue, this gives you kind of a starting place that you can start to think it through, because Alex obviously has done it in energy, but it's not always obvious how that carries over into different issues. And indeed, when we tried to do it ourselves for different issues, like we would sometimes spend weeks, debating it. So it's not always easy to do, but that I think will be a really valuable starting point. Anything else that people want to get into? All right. Well, I hope
You guys
that
want to
was...
ask questions, I'm going to put on with.
Well, I enjoyed it. I thought there was a lot of great points here. I filled up my little notepad. So, yeah, recommender, not a repeater. I think that's a nice tagline.
Yeah, I mean, one other point that I should make is, or it's really just a way of stressing something I've already said, which is that you're sharing how you see the world. And one mistake that I think objectivists make, and I totally get it, I certainly made it, and it comes from a good place, is that you feel that, oh man, I have this philosophy that's a profound value to me, and I want to defend it, and I don't want to get it wrong. I don't want to mess it up. And it's sort of, you feel like you're the representative of objectivism. And that it can be a really bad place. And sometimes it'll lead to, if you've had this experience, which I certainly have. All right, well, I gotta be the defender of objectivism. Somebody just gave an argument and I don't know the answer to it, but I can't just say, I don't know, I've never thought about that, or that's a good point, I have to think about it more. That's letting down objectivism. That implies that maybe objectivism can't answer this. So I better like bumble around and come up with something. And then like it just can like spiral in a really bad way. And what I really recommend is taking really seriously that you're not a representative of anything. Like that, I mean, that's one of the things that's, it should be like clear from the very philosophy we're trying to spread, is that you're not representing objectivism. It's that you have your way of seeing the world. It's informed by objectivism to the extent that you understand it and agree with it, and that's awesome. But you are not a pawn for the movement, and you're not a mouthpiece for the movement. You're an individual who's thought about certain ideas and come to certain conclusions. And all that persuasion really is, hey, I want to share that with somebody else. And so you're only representing yourself. And if you're representing yourself, like, most people, like, you don't feel this desperate need to be able to answer every question that somebody has about physics. Even if you know a lot about physics, you answer the ones you know, and then you go, yeah, I don't know that. That's a really interesting question. And like, you're totally cool with that, right? And it's the same thing about philosophy. This isn't a religion. Religion is, there's the dogma, which means there's the answer to everything. And so like, we can train our little, the equivalent of the Mormon missionaries. Like, this is what you say when person says X, and this is what you say when person says Y. And then you go out and you be a little mouthpiece. It's no, you're a thinker. And what your job is to say, this is what I know, don't know that. I remember, I had a friend once who gave a lecture on this that was really valuable, but I don't even remember what he said, but I remember being impressed with the answer. I'll get back to you, and it's that kind of thing. It's just being objective about what you know, what you don't know, and what you kind of know, and not accepting, not having a cross to bear, as it were. And it should feel very liberating. And remember, hey, like, there's objectivist intellectuals, myself included, who have like said completely wrong things on TV, and it's not the end of the world for the movement. So like, if you get into a debate with somebody, like standing in line at the baseball game or whatever, and get something wrong, like, you have not destroyed the hopes for the future. So you should feel very free in these kinds of cases. If you are going to be a professional intellectual, I would say, though, you should really know what you're talking about, or find another job. That's an issue of integrity. And, one of the differences, or let me put it this way. All of us have the right to share the way we see the world with everybody. But if you're going to be a spokesperson for a philosophy, and if we're thinking about a philosophy being influential culturally, a crucial dynamic you have to realize is that it is the best minds who are really going to shape the culture. Because as Leonard Peikoff talks about in the dim hypothesis, that philosophy shapes a culture primarily through cultural products. And it's the best minds who create philosophically informed cultural products in fields like education, in fields like history, in fields like science. And so what has to happen for us as a movement to really have influence is that we have the best minds in those fields informed by our philosophy. And when you're thinking about that dynamic, there's something you have to really take seriously. And this is, I've talked about this, I think, a little bit on HBL, but it's, buried in one of those threads that people probably stopped reading, weeks ago. But I think it's an important point, so I wanted to make it here, which is Steve Jobs has this line about A players only want to work with A players. As soon as you hire a B player, they want to hire a bunch of C players, and pretty soon you get a bozo explosion. And the point is that, the point is, Steve Jobs is awesome because bozo explosion is the greatest phrase that anyone has ever come up with. But more importantly, the issue is this: the smartest minds, and I mean like the young ones who are still formulating a worldview, they have a very powerful radar for who are actual other top minds. And nothing an attack on objectivism can do to discredit objectivism can come close to what having incompetent defenders. And I don't just mean like men in the street, but if you are like, I'm, so-and-so, like a renowned author in this philosophy, let's say, or whatever, and they don't think that you are a deeply smart person and a first-handed interesting thinker, then they want nothing to do with you. And so the spokespeople for a philosophy, I think, have a moral obligation not just to like agree with the philosophy, but to be really, really smart and first-handed. That is, when you're with a powerful thinker, even if they agree with objectivism, there's something different about being with that kind of person. They just see the world, and they're constantly like, this is one of the things that I love about like people like Alex and Onkar and Greg Salmieri and Tara Smith. It's that if you sit with them and talk about anything, you don't feel like, oh, they're just saying things I've heard before. They're saying things you never heard before, even if they're saying something that you've heard before, but it's in such a different way with this interesting way of coming at it, new examples that you get. There's a mind here, right? And outside of objectivism, there's people like that too, who you might think they get more stuff wrong because they don't have a good framework, but you get, oh, this is a thinker who's saying things like, if you listen to somebody like Sam Harris, I've mentioned Peterson, even some people who are a little bit more mainstream, like Matt Iglesias on the left, you get the idea of this is a real mind here, and that B players, it's not just that they have no impact, it's that they can have a real negative impact. The point is not that they shouldn't have anything to do with objectivism, and I don't necessarily, I would hesitate even to put myself in the A player category. I don't think about it in those terms. But in part, I'm not trying to become famous. I'm more working with people who are going to go and become the representatives. But what you need to do is think, what should my proper role be? So for instance, one of the things that we have at CIP is that Alex works with a lot of really smart people who might not be A players in terms of they could go out there and be the spokesman for the way we think about energy, but they know something really valuable that they can help Alex be that guy who's out there, be more effective. They're really great at research. They have insight into how the policy system works in Washington. Like they're, nuclear engineers who can tell us like the details of, how a nuclear plant works and what kind of regulations there are. You can use your skills to be a really good editor or something. There's lots of things that people can do. But in terms of being a spokesperson for the philosophy, I think you need to be really honest with yourself about, will the best young minds walk away being impressed, even if they disagree? And, that can be an uncomfortable question to ask yourself, but I think it's really crucial.
Don, yes, on the subject of method of persuasion, the debates, which were socialism or capitalism, I think that's the subject, which is the moral system. What did you think about the methods that Peikoff and Ridpath were using? And then there was also, I didn't mean to leave out the other philosopher, I've forgotten his name.
I haven't seen it since I was a teenager, so I couldn't. I wouldn't be able to give you a fully informed one. I say with some hesitancy, my recollection watching it as a teenager was I wasn't completely happy with how it was being argued in that context. I thought the back and forths were much better than the opening statements. But again, I say that with very big hesitancy because it's been decades since I've watched it. In part, I have trouble watching debates. They make me very, very anxious. It's actually easier for me to participate in them than to watch them. And even participating in them is not a good thing or not my favorite thing to do. But debates are very hard for many reasons. They have many unique features so that somebody can be like the upper echelon of persuasive teachers, writers, and be bad in a debate and not have it work in a debate. And in part, it's because what a debate allows for is for a lot more tactical maneuvers that are illegitimate, but not obviously illegitimate to the audience in the moment. and it can be unclear how to disarm them. And then you also have to think that objectivism has a real debating disadvantage. This can be overcome, but you have to really take seriously that you're getting equal time. They have a conventional view with a conventional context, and you have an unconventional view with an unconventional context, which means which one do you think is a lot easier to like give a 10-second response to something, an unconventional or conventional view? And so, whereas if you're just writing like an essay or something, like you get to make your point and the person gets to sit with it, and they'll have all kinds of questions and things, but you don't engage in that. So I mean, I'll tell you, when I was doing debates, this is literally, I spent 40 to 100 hours preparing for each one of them. Now, I don't think on my feet very well, so this is more than what most debaters probably need to do. But I literally went through every conceivable thing that I thought my opponent would say based on research I had done. And then it would be, how would I respond to this in 1 to 3 sentences? And worked out just dozens and dozens and dozens of these like super quick ways, because the point was I knew in most cases I was only going to have 1 to 3 sentences. And if I could elaborate after that, that's great. But I needed to have something that quickly got across what my idea was in a persuasive way that would be very hard to attack and that would be very sticky and memorable. And when I did that, it really paid off. The one debate where I was like, hey, I'm good at this, and just went in, off the without that prep, it was a complete disaster. Now, to be fair to me, that was a debate where we were told beforehand, hey, you guys should just feel free to interrupt each other. Let's get some energy into this. And that, I'm not good at interrupting people because I hate it in debates when people interrupt. And I got a guy who was constantly interrupting me. And then I had people in the front row who every time I said something were just going, oh. And that was, so there were other things going on in that debate. But my point is that it is, objectivists can do very well in debates and have done very well. And I think Leonard and John did very well overall, but that there's unique challenges that are very hard to overcome. And we should be impressed when objectivist even comes across decent in a debate, because it's such a hard thing to do. But I hate them, so I don't watch them.
So not as effective, and it's Harry Binswanger, I think. Is that right, Jerry? You don't know? Okay. In one of the debates. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
I mean, one thing I will say though is one of the things that I did. One of the things I did as I was learning how to be a better communicator and persuader is we did a series of debates with Demos back in the day. Jerry, you might have been at ARI during that time or shortly after that. But like,
I was living in New York though and came to them.
Okay. Yeah. And I think there were like 3 or 4 of them. And for each one of those, I literally went through, and as I was watching them, would, pause, figure out how I would deal with it, then see how the speaker dealt with it, and then analyze what I thought worked or didn't work. You can learn so much by doing it. It doesn't have to be a debate. You can do it like with interviews. But in general, it's a lot easier to see errors that other people are making and then ask yourself, when would I make this? Where do I kind of commit this error? Than it is to just reflect on your own experience. So it's a really valuable tool. And it can be, even if you're not interested in persuasion, even if you don't like want to be a public intellectual, the level of clarity you'll get about your own ideas from doing that, you'll learn so much. You'll make so many connections that you've never thought of. And it's completely non-risky versus, when you get in a debate with somebody, even if it's a one-on-one, you get emotions involved and you have to think really quickly, and and they might just be not that smart and not say anything useful. So I love practices like that, and find them very, very helpful. And you don't have to do it all the time. Like I mean, I did it for those, and maybe I did it, 5 or 6 other times throughout the years whenever I thought there was a really interesting interview or a really bad one that I saw that I was angry about. Hopefully where I was not the victim of it. But if you do it occasionally, you can get just a lot out of it.
Well, thank you, Don. It was very enjoyable and informative.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. I hope you guys got a lot out of it, and I hope that once I make it down to Texas, which I mean, I guess I will for Ocon, but I hope I'll be seeing some of you there. But if not, then hopefully in the near rather than the far future. And yeah, as I said, always feel free to email me. I'm pretty responsive at don@donswriting.com. Any question, any issue that you think I can be helpful with, that is what I'm here for.
Keep on doing what you're doing, Don. It's
Thank
important
you.
to have someone like you helping others, like Mark and others, get their words out.
Yeah, well, that's I'll just say a word about this before we sign off, which is I benefited so much from the fact that I was able to work at ARI for 11 years and then work with Alex for 3 full years full time. Like, I couldn't have gotten where I am without going through that. And very few people have that privilege, right? Like, that is such an unusual thing to get to do. And yet there's a lot of people who could be doing really valuable stuff to promote our ideas and our ideals. And so it just, I'm so interested in these issues, and I'm really interested in being useful to the objectivist movement, because it's funny, my job has been to change the culture, and I don't really care about the culture. I mean, I care in the sense of I want good ideas to win, but I'm interested in our movement. Those are where my friends are. It's the people I most respect and admire. And so to be able to like take this thing that I got through this really hard to get set of circumstances, and then to be able to make it as widely available and as scalable as possible, that's really why I'm in this. And so, to the extent that I can do that for you, or for, if you spot, particularly if you guys meet any like really young people you think are promising, I do. Basically, my rule is I'm either really expensive or free. So I do a lot of free consulting for young objectivists who I think are really trying to, make a career for themselves, and, send them my way, because that's really important to me. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. This is a real pleasure, and I look forward to talking to you guys in the future.
All right.
Thank you too.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, John.